My son kicked me out for being an extra mouth. So I bought his building and tripled rent. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But at 72 years old, standing in the lobby of the apartment building I'd just purchased, watching my son's face drain of color as he realized his new landlord was the mother he'd thrown away like garbage, I discovered that revenge tastes even better when it's served with a business contract and eviction papers. "You," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking like he was seeing a ghost. "This can't be real." I smiled, adjusting the property deed in my hands. "Oh, it's very real, son. And your rent just tripled." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a grieving widow with 2 suitcases and a broken heart became the woman who owned her ungrateful child's entire world. But before we get into it, please subscribe to the channel as this gives me the strength to speak my truth. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now let's get into my story. My name is Dorothy Washington, and 6 months ago, I was homeless. Not the kind of homeless you see on street corners with cardboard signs, but the invisible kind. The 72-year-old woman whose own son decided she was too expensive to love. The walls of that apartment witnessed everything. Scraped knees kissed better at 2 a.m., homework sessions that stretched past midnight, birthday parties funded by overtime pay and sheer determination. My late husband Jerome always said I had hands that could heal anything. "Dorothy," he'd whisper when one of the kids had a fever, "you got magic in those fingers." I'd laugh and tell him it wasn't magic, just a mother's love and a nurse's training, but deep down I believed him. I could fix broken toys with duct tape and prayer, mend hurt feelings with homemade cookies, and stretch a dollar until it screamed for mercy. Jerome was my anchor through all of it. When the hospital shifts left me bone-tired, he'd rub my feet while we planned for the children's futures. When Marcus needed money for college, Jerome picked up weekend construction work without complaint. When our daughter Lisa got married, he worked 3 months of overtime to pay for a wedding that made her feel like a princess. We were a team, him and me against the world, building something beautiful out of very little. But last winter, everything changed. Jerome's cough, which we'd attributed to 40 years of cigarettes and Detroit winters, turned out to be something far more sinister. Stage 4 lung cancer, the doctor said, his voice gentle but final. 6 months if we were lucky, maybe less. Jerome took the news like he took everything else, with quiet dignity and a protective arm around my shoulders. "We've had a good run, he said in the hospital parking lot. 45 years of good runs." Those 6 months stretched and compressed like time does when you're watching someone you love slip away gradually. Then all at once, I took leave from the hospital to care for him, feeding him through a straw when swallowing became too hard, reading him the sports section when his eyes grew too tired for the print. The house that had once been filled with laughter and chaos became a shrine to whispered conversations and measured breathing. When Jerome passed on a Tuesday morning in February, holding my hand and wearing the smile that had first caught my attention at a church social in 1976, my world didn't just tilt sideways. It shattered completely. 45 years of marriage doesn't just end with a funeral service and a gravestone. It echoes in every empty coffee cup left on the kitchen counter, every quiet evening when no one asks about your day, every decision you used to make together now falling solely on shoulders that suddenly feel too narrow to bear the weight. That's when Marcus, my eldest, stepped forward with his solution. "Mama, you can't stay in that big house alone," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying the authority he'd developed climbing the corporate ladder at a tech company in downtown Atlanta. At 47, he'd grown into the kind of man who commanded respect in boardrooms, his tailored suits and confident handshake opening doors I'd only dreamed of walking through. His wife Keisha nodded beside him, her manicured hand resting supportively on his arm, her expression the perfect picture of concerned daughterly care. Their suburban Atlanta home was everything I'd dreamed of giving my children when I worked those double shifts and counted pennies for school supplies. The foyer alone was bigger than my old living room, with marble floors that gleamed under a crystal chandelier. The kitchen boasted granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and an island bigger than my entire Detroit kitchen. A 3-car garage housed Marcus's BMW, Keisha's Lexus SUV, and enough space for the boat they took to Lake Lanier on weekends. The neighborhood was the kind where the lawns stayed emerald green year-round, where children rode expensive bicycles down tree-lined streets, and where homeowner association rules ensured everything looked picture perfect. "We've got the space," Keisha added, her voice warm and welcoming. "The guest room has its own bathroom, and you know how Zoe adores her grandmother. It would be wonderful having you here." 10-year-old Zoe bounced on her toes, pigtails flying. "Please, Grandma Dorothy. We could have sleepovers every night." Looking at their eager faces, surrounded by all the comfort and security I'd worked my entire life to provide for my children, saying no felt impossible. The house Jerome and I had finally paid off just 5 years before his death suddenly felt cavernous and cold without his presence. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of his footsteps. Every shadow seemed to mock the emptiness where his laughter used to live. I packed my life into carefully labeled boxes, each one a chapter of the story Jerome and I had written together. Wedding photos from 1976, when we were young and believed love could conquer anything. Report cards from 3 children who'd gone on to build successful lives. Christmas ornaments collected over decades of holidays that had grown more elaborate as our finances improved. The realtor, a kind woman with gentle eyes, assured me I could always buy something else later. "The market's good right now, Mrs. Washington. This gives you flexibility, options for the future." I trusted that. More importantly, I trusted Marcus. This was my son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, whose fever I'd nursed through countless nights, who I'd worked 3 jobs to put through Georgia Tech. He'd called me every Sunday for 25 years, never missing Mother's Day, always the first to arrive at family gatherings with flowers and compliments about my cooking. If Marcus said this was the right move, then it had to be. The day I moved in, Keisha had prepared my favorite meal, fried chicken, mac and cheese, green beans seasoned with ham hock the way my grandmother taught me. Zoe had made a welcome sign decorated with glitter and hearts. Marcus carried my boxes with the same careful attention he'd shown as a child when helping with groceries. For the first time since Jerome's funeral, I felt like I might be home again. But as I unpacked my belongings in their beautiful guest room, arranging my modest possessions among their expensive furnishings, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered a question I wasn't ready to hear. How long is temporary when you have nowhere else to go? The first month felt like an extended holiday visit, the kind where everyone's on their best behavior and small irritations get swept under rugs of politeness and good intentions. Keisha made my favorite cornbread every Tuesday, following the recipe I'd taught her when she and Marcus first started dating 15 years ago. Marcus asked about my doctor appointments with genuine concern, accompanying me to the cardiologist when my blood pressure medication needed adjusting. Their 10-year-old daughter Zoe would curl up next to me on the leather sectional every evening, her small body warm against my side as I told her stories about her grandfather Jerome and the neighborhood where her daddy grew up. "Tell me the one about Daddy and the stray cat again," she'd beg, her eyes bright with the same curiosity Marcus had shown as a child. I'd describe how 8-year-old Marcus had smuggled a half-starved tabby into our apartment, hiding it in his closet for 3 days before the mewing gave him away. Grandpa Jerome pretended to be mad. I'd continue, but I caught him feeding that cat bologna in the middle of the night. Zoe would giggle, and for those moments the house felt like home. But slowly, like morning fog lifting to reveal sharp edges underneath, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that made my chest tight with familiar anxiety. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, voices dropping to whispers that resumed only after I'd passed. Keisha's smile started feeling rehearsed, her warmth dimming from genuine to performative. Marcus began working late more often, leaving me with a daughter-in-law who clearly hadn't signed up for a permanent houseguest, but was too polite to say so directly. I tried to make myself useful, contribute something valuable to justify my presence in their perfectly ordered lives. I woke early to prepare breakfast before Marcus left for work, standing at their granite counter in my worn house slippers, scrambling eggs and frying bacon the way Jerome liked it. I helped with cooking and cleaning, my 72-year-old hands still steady enough to fold fitted sheets and scrub shower tiles. I offered to babysit Zoe whenever they needed date nights or social events, ready to sacrifice my own comfort for their convenience. But nothing felt quite right anymore. My offers to help were met with polite declinations. "Oh, Mrs. Washington, you don't need to do that," Keisha would say, gently taking the dish towel from my hands. "You're our guest." The word guest began to feel like a cage, pretty and comfortable but constraining nonetheless. Guests were temporary. Guests had their own homes to return to. Guests didn't rearrange spice cabinets or suggest different routes to Zoe's school. I started keeping to my room more, emerging only for meals and brief conversations that felt increasingly strained. The beautiful guest room, with its coordinated bedding and carefully arranged fresh flowers, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a holding cell decorated in beige and rose gold. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their house settling, wondering when I'd stopped feeling welcome and started feeling like an obligation they were too kind to abandon. The breaking point came disguised as a kindness, the way destruction often does in families that pride themselves on never raising their voices or acknowledging uncomfortable truths directly. It happened over Sunday dinner, one of those golden afternoon meals where sunlight streamed through their dining room windows, and everything should have felt perfect. I had spent the morning in their kitchen, preparing my grandmother's famous mac and cheese recipe. The one with 3 different cheeses, a hint of mustard powder, and breadcrumbs toasted to the perfect shade of golden brown. This wasn't just any recipe. It was a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations of women who understood that love could be measured in careful seasoning and patient stirring. The kitchen had become my domain during these months, the one place where I felt useful rather than decorative. I'd wake before dawn, my internal clock still set to decades of hospital shifts, and create small acts of love through food. Fluffy buttermilk biscuits that reminded Marcus of childhood mornings. Peach cobbler that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and nostalgia. Fried chicken seasoned with secrets I'd learned from my mother, who'd learned from hers. That Sunday, I watched my family gather around the polished dining table. Marcus at the head like the patriarch he'd become, Keisha elegant in a way I'd never quite mastered, Zoe chattering about her upcoming school play. The mac and cheese sat in the center of the table, steam rising from the casserole dish like incense, golden and bubbly and perfect. Zoe took her first bite and her eyes widened with the pure joy only children can express without self-consciousness. "Oh my gosh," she exclaimed, cheese stretching from her fork. "This is way better than Mom's." The silence that followed was deafening, thick with the kind of tension that transforms innocent words into weapons. Keisha's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her face flushing pink. Marcus cleared his throat, a warning sound I recognized from his childhood. The compliment that should have warmed my heart instead felt like a grenade rolling across their perfect table. "Zoe," Keisha said quietly, her voice controlled but strained, "that's not polite." "But it's true," Zoe protested, oblivious to the emotional minefield she'd stumbled into. "It's like super cheesy and the top is all crunchy and..." "That's enough," Marcus said firmly, and my granddaughter's mouth snapped shut, confusion clouding her bright eyes. The rest of the meal passed in stilted conversation about safe topics, the weather, Zoe's soccer schedule, Marcus's upcoming business trip. But the damage was done, floating in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge was burning. Later that evening, I was in my room reading when their voices carried through the walls that suddenly seemed paper-thin. Their house, for all its expensive construction and architectural beauty, couldn't contain the kind of argument that had been building for months. "She's been here 4 months, Marcus." "For months?" Keisha's voice was tight with frustration she'd been swallowing for too long. "When is this temporary arrangement going to end?" "She just lost Dad. Give her time." Marcus sounded tired, caught between 2 women he loved but couldn't please simultaneously. "Time? She's rearranging our kitchen, telling me how to parent Zoe, and now she's making our daughter prefer her cooking to mine. This is our house, not a retirement home." Each word landed like a physical blow. My heart cracked a little more with each accusation, some fair, some cruel, all devastating in their honesty. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, needing to hear my fate being decided by the people I'd sacrificed everything to love and support. The conversation that followed would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. I just knew that lying in that beautiful guest room, listening to my son and daughter-in-law debate my worth like a budget line item, I felt smaller than I had since Jerome's funeral. And for the first time since moving in, I wondered if love was supposed to feel this much like burden. Marcus approached me the next morning while I was tending to the small herb garden I'd started by their back patio. A modest collection of basil, rosemary, and mint planted in terracotta pots I'd bought with my own money. Gardening had always been my meditation, my hands finding peace in soil and seeds the way some people found comfort in prayer. Jerome used to joke that I could make anything grow, children, vegetables, hope in the darkest corners. This little garden was my attempt to root myself in their world, to create something beautiful and useful that justified my presence. The morning sun felt warm on my shoulders as I watered each plant carefully, whispering encouragement the way my grandmother had taught me. Plants respond to love, she'd always said, just like people do. But as I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stone pathway behind me, heavy with purpose and reluctance, I wondered if some people had stopped believing in that kind of nurturing. His shadow fell across my herb garden before his voice did. "Mama, we need to talk." The tone was wrong, not the warm familiarity of a son speaking to his mother, but the careful formality of a businessman delivering unwelcome news. I set down my watering can and faced him, this man who'd grown from the baby I'd nursed through colic, through the teenager who'd called me crying from college when he failed his first exam, through the young man who'd stood in this very backyard 5 years ago asking for my blessing to propose to Keisha. His shoulders were tense, his usual warmth replaced by something that looked disturbingly like a board meeting demeanor. The expensive shirt, the carefully styled hair, the way he stood with his feet planted and his hands clasped behind his back, everything about his posture said this conversation had been rehearsed. "What's on your mind, son?" I asked, though my heart was already preparing for impact. Marcus couldn't meet my eyes. His gaze focused somewhere over my left shoulder where morning glories climbed the fence I'd helped him install 3 summers ago. "Mama, you know we love having you here." The word but hung in the air between us like a blade waiting to fall. "Keisha thinks. We think it might be time for you to consider other living arrangements." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my knees weak. I gripped the edge of the planter box to steady myself, feeling the rough concrete against my palms, grounding myself in something solid while my world tilted dangerously. "Other arrangements?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding foreign and small. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his discomfort obvious but not enough to stop him from continuing. "There are some nice senior communities in the area. Places where you'd have your own space, activities with people your age, medical support if you need it. I've already looked into a few. Some of them are really beautiful, Mama. Like resorts." The words felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror, or maybe in front of Keisha, perfecting the delivery until it sounded reasonable instead of devastating. "You mean places where I won't be an extra mouth to feed?" He flinched as if I'd slapped him, color draining from his face. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, son?" I kept my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds exactly like that." The silence stretched between us like a chasm 47 years wide. I was looking at a stranger wearing my child's face, speaking words I'd never imagined hearing from lips I'd kissed better after playground falls. The weight of those unspoken words, extra mouth, settled between us like a stone in still water, sending ripples through decades of shared history. I could see Marcus struggling with the phrase, his jaw working as if he were chewing something bitter. The successful executive who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms looked suddenly young and uncertain, caught between the life he'd built and the woman who'd made that life possible. "Mama, please don't make this harder than it already is," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the word please. "You know this isn't about money." But it was about money, at least partially. I could see it in the way his eyes darted toward their 3-car garage, where 2 luxury vehicles sat as monuments to their comfortable lifestyle. It was in the manicured lawn maintained by a service that came every Thursday, in Zoe's private school tuition, in the vacation photos from their annual trips to places I'd only seen in magazines. My presence, my needs, my very existence had become a line item in their budget that no longer balanced in their favor. "Then what is it about?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Help me understand how the woman who raised you, who worked 3 jobs to put you through college, who never missed a single one of your football games or graduation ceremonies, suddenly becomes someone you need to relocate." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was caught between truth and convenience. "It's not that simple." It seems pretty simple from where I'm standing. Your wife doesn't want me here, and you're choosing her comfort over my dignity. That's not fair, he protested, finally meeting my eyes. Keisha's been patient, more patient than most people would be. But this was supposed to be temporary, just until you got back on your feet after Dad's death. It's been 4 months. For months. As if grief operated on a schedule. As if the 45 years I'd spent building a life with Jerome could be processed and filed away in the time it takes for seasons to change. As if the loneliness that crept into my bones each night could be cured by a calendar date. And how exactly am I supposed to get back on my feet? I asked. I'm 72 years old, Marcus. I sold the house your father and I spent 30 years paying for, because you said I had a home here. Where exactly am I supposed to go? The question hung between us. And I watched my son realize for perhaps the first time that his solution created a bigger problem than the one it was meant to solve. His face paled as the full weight of what he was asking hit him. He was making his mother homeless, dressing it up in talk of senior communities and activities with people my age, but the truth was stark and unchangeable. I've found some places, he said weakly. Really nice places. I can help with the deposits, the moving costs. You'll pay to get rid of me, but you won't let me stay where I already am. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked everywhere except at my face, his discomfort radiating off him in waves. I could see the boy he'd once been. The one who'd hidden report cards when his grades weren't perfect, who'd broken my favorite vase and tried to glue it back together before I noticed. But that boy had grown into a man who could look his mother in the eye and call her homeless with corporate efficiency. You have 2 weeks, he said finally, the words emerging like they tasted of ash. I'm sorry, Mama. This is just, it's what's best for everyone. Best for everyone. The phrase echoed in my head as I watched my son walk back toward the house, his shoulders straight with the posture of a man who'd made a difficult but necessary business decision. Best for everyone except the woman who'd given up everything to love them unconditionally. I stood there among my herbs, the scent of basil and rosemary filling the morning air, and realized that sometimes the people you love most are the ones most capable of breaking your heart completely. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime. Again. The boxes arrived on a Tuesday, generic brown cardboard containers that Marcus had ordered online, practical and impersonal as everything else about this transition had become. They sat in a neat stack in the guest room that had briefly felt like home, waiting to swallow up the remnants of my existence like hungry mouths. Each empty box represented another piece of my life being reduced to portable, disposable units. I moved through their house like a ghost, carefully collecting the few belongings I'd unpacked during my 4-month stay. The framed photo of Jerome and me on our wedding day, both of us young and believing that love could conquer anything. My mother's Bible, its pages soft with age and marked with decades of hopeful prayers and desperate pleas. The hand-knitted throw blanket I'd made during Jerome's cancer treatments, each stitch a meditation on impermanence and love. Keisha avoided me completely during those 2 weeks, her guilt manifesting as strategic absence. She suddenly had urgent errands that took her out of the house whenever I was packing, important appointments that coincided with my presence in common areas. When we did cross paths, her eyes would slide away from mine, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the flush of shame that colored her cheeks. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that choosing your marriage over your mother-in-law wasn't unusual or even wrong. But understanding and forgiveness were different animals, and I wasn't ready to tame the latter yet. Zoe was the hardest part. She kept appearing in doorways like a lost spirit, watching me fold clothes and wrap picture frames with the wide-eyed confusion of a child whose world was shifting in ways she couldn't comprehend. Why are you putting everything in boxes again, Grandma Dorothy? She'd ask, her voice small and uncertain. Are you going on a trip? Something like that, baby girl. I'd answer. Because how do you explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes adults make decisions that hurt the people they claim to love? How do you tell a child that her parents had chosen comfort over compassion, convenience over family loyalty? The night before my departure, Zoe snuck into my room after her parents had gone to bed. She wore her favorite pajamas, the ones with dancing unicorns that she'd outgrown but refused to abandon. Her feet were bare, and she padded across the carpet with the stealth of someone who knew she was breaking rules, but couldn't help herself. Grandma, are you leaving because of something I did? She whispered, climbing onto the bed where I sat surrounded by half-packed boxes. Because I said your mac and cheese was better than Mama's? I didn't mean to make anyone mad. My heart cracked open at her question, at the weight of adult consequences settling on her small shoulders. I pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her Johnson's baby shampoo, feeling her bird-like heartbeat against my chest. No, baby girl. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense to anyone but them. Will I still see you? She asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I couldn't promise her anything, couldn't lie about an uncertain future that depended entirely on parents who were shipping me away like an unwanted piece of furniture. I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so. Marcus hired movers for the morning of my departure. Efficient professionals who arrived promptly at 8 a.m. with dollies and moving blankets. He'd found me a studio apartment across town, a clean but soulless space in a complex called Sunset Manor. The kind of name designed to make loneliness sound romantic. It's got good natural light, he said, as if sunbeams could fill the hole where my family used to be. As the movers loaded my life into their truck, I stood in the driveway where I'd arrived 4 months earlier with hope and the naive belief that family meant forever. Marcus handed me an envelope containing my new address, keys, and a check for the first month's rent and deposit. His generosity felt like blood money, payment for services no longer required. Mama, he said as I prepared to follow the moving truck to my new life, this doesn't mean we don't love you. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be better than this moment, and spoke the truth that would echo between us for months to come. Love isn't what you feel, Marcus. It's what you do. And what you've done is make your mother homeless rather than ask your wife to share her space with grace. The drive to Sunset Manor took 20 minutes through Atlanta traffic, but it felt like crossing into another country entirely, one where mothers were disposable and family was conditional. The studio apartment at Sunset Manor was clean but soulless, a rectangular box designed for efficiency rather than living. Beige walls met beige carpet in corners that had never witnessed laughter or tears, celebrations or mourning. The single window offered a view of the parking lot where I could watch other residents, mostly elderly, mostly alone, coming and going from lives that had been downsized to fit spaces like mine. The kitchenette was barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably, with a 2-burner stove, a half-sized refrigerator, and cabinets that couldn't hold a week's worth of groceries. After decades of cooking for family, of filling large tables with abundant meals that brought people together, this felt like being placed in a dollhouse version of domestic life. I unpacked slowly, each item a reminder of what I'd lost twice now. First Jerome, then the illusion that blood guaranteed belonging. My wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper for 50 years, looked absurd hanging in a closet that could barely accommodate a week's worth of clothes. The china set my mother had given me, service for 12, seemed to mock the reality that I might never again host a meal for more than one. But it was the silence that hit hardest. In Detroit, our house had been filled with the sounds of life, Jerome humming while he shaved, neighborhood children playing in the street, the comfortable creaks and sighs of a home that had sheltered love for decades. Here, the only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning unit, and the occasional footstep from the apartment above mine, where another displaced soul was learning to navigate reduced circumstances. My savings account was healthier than Marcus knew, a fact I'd kept private out of maternal instinct to let my children believe they were more financially secure than their parents. Jerome had been careful with money, conservative in his investments, and disciplined about saving even when it meant wearing shoes with holes and eating beans for dinner. The house had sold for more than expected, the life insurance had been substantial, and 47 years of modest living had accumulated into what most people would consider wealth. But being financially comfortable didn't ease the sting of emotional abandonment. Money couldn't buy back my son's respect or my daughter-in-law's tolerance. It couldn't fill the empty chair across from me at meals, or provide conversation during the long evening hours when loneliness felt like a physical weight on my chest. The first week passed in a haze of routine establishment. I found a grocery store within walking distance, though its selection was limited and expensive. I located the nearest library, a small branch with outdated computers and a limited selection of large print books. I identified a church within bus range. Though the congregation was unfamiliar, and the hymns were sung in keys my voice couldn't match after 50 years of a different musical tradition. Each day I woke with the discipline instilled by decades of hospital work, but with no clear purpose to structure my hours around. I'd make coffee for one, eat breakfast at a table designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and face the question that had been haunting me since Marcus delivered his ultimatum. What does a 72-year-old woman do when her children decide she's disposable? The answer came unexpectedly, on a Thursday morning when restlessness drove me to explore beyond the comfortable radius I'd established around Sunset Manor. 3 blocks away, in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation office, I found a small coffee shop called Second Chances. The name felt like a message from Jerome, who'd always believed that life offered multiple opportunities for happiness if you were brave enough to recognize them. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered Second Chances, and immediately I felt something I hadn't experienced since moving to Sunset Manor. The possibility of human connection. The coffee shop was small but warm, with mismatched furniture that suggested comfort over style, and walls covered with local artwork that spoke of a community I hadn't yet discovered. The air smelled of freshly ground beans and baked goods, scents that reminded me of Sunday mornings when Jerome would surprise me with pastries from the bakery near our church. Behind the counter stood a woman about my age, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved with the economy of motion that comes from years of working with your hands, and when she smiled at me, it reached all the way to those intelligent eyes. A name tag identified her as Mrs. Chin, and something about her presence suggested she understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. "You new to the area?" she asked as she prepared my coffee, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but had mastered it completely. "New to being alone," I replied before I could stop myself, surprised by my own honesty. Mrs. Chen paused in her coffee preparation, studying my face with the kind of attention that suggested she'd heard those words before, possibly from her own lips. She finished making my coffee, then surprised me by pouring herself a cup and joining me at a small table by the window. "Honey," she said, settling into her chair with the grace of someone who'd learned to make herself comfortable anywhere. "Alone and lonely aren't the same thing. One's a circumstance, the other's a choice." Her words settled into my chest like seeds finding fertile ground. We sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the morning traffic navigate the busy street outside. Mrs. Chen didn't ask questions or offer advice, didn't try to fill the space between us with chatter or platitudes. She simply sat with me in my solitude, making it feel less like isolation and more like companionship. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she said eventually, her voice matter-of-fact rather than mournful. "Cancer. 43 years of marriage. And then one day I woke up and half of my conversations were with someone who wasn't there anymore." I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. The phantom conversations were real. Asking Jerome what he wanted for dinner, telling him about something funny Zoe had said, seeking his opinion on decisions both large and small. The silence that followed these one-sided exchanges was always a fresh reminder of the permanence of loss. "My children thought I should sell the house, move somewhere smaller, more manageable," Mrs. Chen continued. "But I wasn't ready to manage less life. I was ready to manage different life." She gestured around the coffee shop with obvious pride. "Used my savings to buy this place. Former owner was retiring, needed to sell quickly. I'd never run a business before, but I figured I'd been managing a household for 43 years. How different could it be?" As I walked home that afternoon, Mrs. Chen's words echoed in my mind like a mantra. "Alone and lonely aren't the same thing. One's a circumstance, the other's a choice." For the first time since Jerome's death, I began to consider that maybe my current situation wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a different chapter entirely. 3 blocks from Second Chances, I passed an elegant apartment complex where young professionals hurried in and out, their lives busy with the kind of purpose I remembered having when my children were young and my career was demanding. A for sale sign caught my eye, and I stopped to read it more carefully. Investment opportunity, 24-unit building, motivated seller. Something stirred in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. Curiosity. Not just about the building itself, but about the possibilities it represented. What if Mrs. Chun was right? What if this wasn't about managing less life, but about managing different life? That night, for the first time since Jerome's funeral, I did something that felt like planning for the future instead of mourning the past. I cleared the small table in my studio apartment, opened my laptop, a gift from Marcus 3 Christmases ago that I'd barely used, and began researching the apartment building I'd seen that afternoon. The process felt familiar in ways I hadn't expected. Decades of nursing had taught me to gather information systematically, to look beyond surface symptoms to understand underlying conditions. I approached this building the same way I'd once approached a complex patient case. Methodically, thoroughly, with attention to details that others might overlook. The building was called Magnolia Court Apartments, built in 1994 during Atlanta's pre-Olympic construction boom. 24 units total, 16 one-bedrooms and 8 two-bedrooms, all with updated kitchens and bathrooms completed within the last 5 years. The exterior was red brick with white trim, mature landscaping, and a parking lot that could accommodate 30 vehicles. According to the listing, it maintained a 90% occupancy rate, which spoke to decent management and satisfied tenants. The asking price was substantial, $2.8 million, but within my means if I used Jerome's life insurance payout combined with the proceeds from our house sale. The numbers made my palms sweat, but they also made my heart race with something I'd almost forgotten. Excitement about possibilities rather than anxiety about limitations. What happened next surprised even me. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or accepting my reduced circumstances, something fierce awakened inside me. The same determination that had gotten me through nursing school while raising 3 children and working nights at the hospital. I turned my tiny studio apartment into a war room. YouTube became my Harvard Business School, with videos explaining cash flow analysis and property management strategies playing until 2 a.m. I took notes in a composition book like a general planning a campaign, filling pages with ammunition I'd never needed before. Cap rates that could make or break deals, tenant screening procedures that separated reliable renters from disasters waiting to happen. The local library became my intelligence headquarters. I checked out every book on real estate investment, studying them like medical textbooks. The librarian, Janet, started saving the newest property management guides for me. Planning to become a real estate mogul? She asked one afternoon, watching me struggle with a particularly complex legal document about eviction procedures. Planning to become dangerous, I replied and meant it. Each piece of knowledge felt like a weapon being added to my arsenal. In the hospital, information had been life or death. Knowing which medications could kill a patient, recognizing sepsis before it became fatal, understanding how to fight for patients when doctors missed crucial symptoms. Now I was learning a different kind of life or death skill. How to control the roofs over people's heads. The building was owned by an elderly man named Harold Fitzgerald, who wanted to retire to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. His asking price was fair, maybe even generous, based on the comparable sales I'd researched. The property generated approximately $18,000 in monthly rental income, with expenses for maintenance, insurance, and property management running about $8,000 monthly. Even accounting for vacancies and unexpected repairs, the numbers promised both steady income and long-term appreciation. But more than the financial opportunity, I was drawn to the idea of providing homes for people, creating stable, well-maintained spaces where families could build their lives. After feeling unwanted and disposable in my own son's house, the prospect of being someone who offered shelter rather than someone who needed it felt like a profound shift in identity. I drove by Magnolia Court every day that week, at different times and from different angles, studying the building like a surgeon examining X-rays. The tenants I observed seemed to be mostly young professionals, people arriving home from work in business attire, walking small dogs, carrying groceries and dry cleaning. The kind of responsible adults who paid their rent on time and treated their homes with respect. On Friday afternoon, I called the listing agent and scheduled a tour for the following Monday. As I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking with a mixture of fear and anticipation. At 72, I was about to make the biggest financial decision of my life. One that could either secure my independence, or destroy the financial security Jerome had worked so hard to provide. But for the first time since moving to Sunset Manor, I was making a choice rather than accepting someone else's decision about my future. And that felt like the first step toward reclaiming not just my dignity, but my agency in determining how the rest of my story would unfold. "Mrs. Washington, are you sure about this?" the realtor asked for the third time as we sat in her office reviewing the purchase agreement. Sarah Mitchell was a competent professional in her 40s who specialized in investment properties, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she watched a 72-year-old woman prepare to invest her life savings in rental real estate. Managing rental property is a big responsibility, especially at this stage of life. I appreciated her tactful avoidance of the word age, but I also recognized the assumption underlying her concern, that elderly people should be reducing complexity in their lives, not adding it. Society expected women my age to downsize, simplify, accept diminishing roles in a world that valued youth and vigor above wisdom and determination. "I've been taking care of people my whole life," I replied, signing the documents with a steady hand despite the magnitude of the moment. "This is just expanding my definition of family." The financing had been surprisingly straightforward. My credit score, built over decades of careful bill paying and conservative financial management, opened doors that might have remained closed to someone with less established financial history. The bank approved my loan application with minimal documentation, impressed by my substantial down payment and the property's strong rental history. Within 30 days, I owned Magnolia Court Apartments, 24 units of brick and possibility, a collection of homes that represented both my financial future and my emotional independence. The deed felt heavy in my hands, not from its physical weight, but from the responsibility it represented. I was now responsible for providing shelter to nearly 50 people, for maintaining their homes, for being someone they could depend on when faucets leaked or air conditioners failed. I hired Peachtree Property Management, a local company with an excellent reputation and reasonable fees. Their services included rent collection, maintenance coordination, tenant screening, and legal compliance, all the technical aspects of property ownership that I was still learning. But I made it clear from the beginning. I wanted to be involved in every decision, informed about every issue, connected to the daily reality of what it meant to provide homes for people. My first order of business was researching my tenants, reviewing their lease agreements and payment histories with the methodical attention I'd once applied to patient charts. Most were exemplary renters, young professionals who paid on time, graduate students who kept their units clean, small families who treated their apartments like the homes they couldn't yet afford to buy. The building hummed with the quiet contentment of people who felt secure in their housing, who could focus on building their careers and relationships without worrying about displacement. But one unit stood out from the rest, a troubling pattern that made my stomach clench with recognition, and something that might have been destiny. Unit 18B had a history of late payments, noise complaints, and maintenance requests that suggested the tenants weren't treating their home with the respect it deserved. The lease showed they'd been living there for 8 months, paying below market rent as part of the previous owner's attempt to maintain high occupancy rates. The names on the lease made my hands tremble as I read them. Marcus Washington and Keisha Washington. I stared at those familiar names until they blurred through tears I hadn't expected. Marcus and Keisha had been living in my building for 8 months, since 2 months after they'd kicked me out of their house with 2 suitcases and a hollow excuse about what was best for everyone. They'd been getting a deal on rent while treating me like a financial burden they couldn't afford to carry. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. While they were telling me I was an extra mouth to feed, they were living in housing subsidized by someone else's generosity. While they were shipping me off to a studio apartment because I was disrupting their comfortable lifestyle, they were benefiting from below-market rent that allowed them to maintain their expensive cars and private school tuition for Zoe. I set the papers down carefully and made myself a cup of tea, needing time to process the cosmic joke that had just revealed itself. Jerome had always said that life had a sense of humor, but this felt less like comedy and more like divine intervention, or perhaps justice served with mathematical precision. The question now was what to do with this information, this unexpected power that had literally fallen into my hands through a combination of heartbreak, determination, and what could only be called fate. Unit 18B was registered to Marcus and Keisha Washington, and as I sat at my small kitchen table staring at their lease agreement, the full weight of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just coincidence. This was the universe offering me a choice about how to handle the pain they'd caused, how to respond to being treated like disposable family. The lease revealed details that made their rejection of me even more bitter. They'd been paying $1,200 per month for a two-bedroom apartment that should have rented for at least $1,600 in the current market. The previous owner, Harold Fitzgerald, had kept their rent artificially low as part of his strategy to maintain long-term tenants and avoid turnover costs. They'd been benefiting from this generosity for 8 months, exactly 2 months longer than they'd allowed me to stay in their guest room. While I was counting coins at the grocery store and eating dinner alone in my studio apartment, they were saving $400 every month thanks to someone else's kindness. While they were telling me I needed to consider other living arrangements, they were living in subsidized housing that allowed them to maintain their comfortable lifestyle. The math of their cruelty was laid out in black and white on legal documents that now bore my signature as their new landlord. I spent that evening walking through the building I now owned, using my master key to inspect vacant units, and getting a feel for the property that represented my new identity. The apartments were well maintained, with updated appliances and neutral paint colors that allowed tenants to make the spaces their own. The hallways were clean, the common areas showed signs of respectful use, and the overall atmosphere was one of quiet contentment. But when I reached the second floor and stood outside Unit 18B, my heart began racing with a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully catalog. Behind that door lived my son, my daughter-in-law, and my granddaughter, the family that had decided I was too much trouble to accommodate. They had no idea that the motivated seller, who'd bought their building, was the woman they'd sent away with 2 weeks' notice and a check to cover moving expenses. I pressed my ear to the door, a childish impulse I couldn't resist. Inside, I could hear the television, some sitcom with a laugh track that sounded hollow and artificial. I heard Keisha's voice saying something about grocery shopping, Marcus responding with something I couldn't make out. Normal domestic conversation between people who'd made abnormal decisions about family loyalty. The temptation to knock, to see the shock on their faces when they realized their new landlord was the woman they'd discarded, was almost overwhelming. But something held me back, maybe wisdom, maybe strategy, or maybe just the knowledge that revenge served too quickly loses its flavor. I returned to my studio apartment that night and pulled out the composition book where I'd been taking notes about property management. On a fresh page, I wrote a simple heading: Unit 18B Special Considerations. Underneath, I began listing facts, payment history, maintenance requests, lease terms, market comparisons. But as I wrote, I realized I wasn't just documenting a business decision. I was planning something that felt like justice, served with the patience and precision that only someone who'd been deeply wronged could appreciate. They'd taken everything from me except my dignity and my resources. They had no idea what I was capable of when both of those things were properly motivated. The deed to Magnolia Court sat on my kitchen counter like a promise. I owned the roof over their heads, the lease under their names, and the power to determine how much their comfortable life would cost them going forward. For the first time since Jerome's funeral, I fell asleep with a smile on my face. I spent a week crafting the perfect letter, revising it multiple times until the tone struck exactly the right balance between professional courtesy and subtle authority. The letterhead featured the logo of my newly formed LLC, DW Properties, named after my initials, but also carrying the private meaning of Dorothy's wisdom, a nod to the hard-earned knowledge that had brought me to this moment. The letter went out to all 24 units on a Tuesday morning. Dear valued tenants, I am pleased to introduce myself as the new owner of Magnolia Court Apartments. My name is Dorothy Washington, and through DW Properties, I am committed to maintaining the high standards of living you have come to expect while making improvements that will benefit our entire community. Over the next month, I will be conducting property assessments and reviewing current lease terms to ensure they reflect both market conditions and the value we provide. You may expect some updates to common areas, enhanced security measures, and continued responsive maintenance service. I look forward to meeting each of you personally and creating a living environment where everyone feels valued and secure. Sincerely, Dorothy Washington, owner, DW Properties. Professional, courteous, giving no hint of personal connections or special interest in any particular tenant. I hand-delivered each letter myself, slipping them under doors in the early morning hours when most residents were still asleep. When I reached Unit 18B, I paused longer than necessary, imagining Marcus finding the letter when he stepped out to retrieve his morning newspaper. Marcus called me 3 hours after the letters were delivered. "Mama." His voice was tight with confusion, and something that might have been panic. "What? How did you bought our building?" I was ready for this call, had been practicing my response since the moment I'd signed the purchase agreement. My voice remained calm, businesslike, giving nothing away. "Hello, Marcus. Yes, I made an investment. I hope you're both well." "But how did you afford?" He stopped himself, perhaps realizing that questioning his mother's financial capacity while living in her building was not a position of strength. This is crazy. You can't be our landlord." "I can and I am. Is there a problem with your tenancy I should know about?" The silence on the other end was deafening, filled with all the things he couldn't say. That he'd kicked his mother out for being a financial burden while living in subsidized housing. That he'd underestimated the woman who'd raised him. That the power dynamic between us had shifted in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "No," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a child caught in mischief. "No problems." "Excellent. You should be receiving information about upcoming improvements and any necessary adjustments to lease terms. I trust you'll find everything reasonable and fair." Another pause. "Mama, can we talk about this? I mean, really talk?" "We are talking, Marcus. This is a business relationship now. If you have concerns about your lease or the property, please direct them to Peachtree Property Management. Their contact information is in the letter." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline, and something that felt remarkably like power. For months, I'd been the one making desperate phone calls, asking for consideration, hoping for kindness. Now Marcus was the one calling me, needing something I had the authority to give or withhold. The reversal felt like justice, but it also felt like responsibility. I owned more than their building now. I owned their security, their comfort, their peace of mind. The question was what kind of landlord I intended to be. Generous like Harold Fitzgerald, or fair in ways that might be harder for them to swallow. I spent the next month conducting what I called market research, but what felt more like detective work, reviewing all the lease agreements in detail, and comparing them to current rental rates in the area. Most tenants were paying fair market value for their units, with adjustments that had kept pace with Atlanta's rising housing costs. A few longtime residents were slightly below market rate, but nothing that suggested the previous owner had been taken advantage of. Except for Unit 18B and 2 others that had been significantly underpriced as part of Harold Fitzgerald's tenant retention strategy. Marcus and Keisha weren't the only ones benefiting from artificially low rent, but they were the only ones whose below-market rate felt personal. The numbers told a story that made my chest tight with anger I'd been suppressing for months. At $1,200 per month for a 2-bedroom apartment with updated appliances, parking, and access to the building's amenities, they were saving approximately $400 per month compared to market rate. Over 8 months, that amounted to $3,200 in savings, more than enough to cover the costs of having me as a houseguest for the 4 months they'd begrudgingly tolerated my presence. They'd claimed they couldn't afford an extra mouth to feed, but they'd been pocketing hundreds of dollars every month thanks to someone else's generosity. The mathematical proof of their lies sat in front of me in black and white, as clear as any medical chart I'd ever read. I had my property management company send out notices to all tenants whose rents were significantly below market value. Due to recent property improvements and comprehensive market analysis, rent adjustments will take effect upon lease renewal to reflect current market rates and ensure continued quality service. Most tenants understood. Atlanta's rental market had been climbing steadily, and rents throughout the city hadn't been adjusted in 3 years. My increases were still reasonable for the area, actually more conservative than what some corporate landlords were charging for similar properties. Marcus and Keisha's rent would increase from $1,200 to $1,800 per month, Still fair for a two-bedroom apartment in their desirable neighborhood, but a significant jump from the sweetheart deal they'd been enjoying. The increase would bring their housing costs to exactly what they should have been paying all along, nothing more and nothing less than fair market value. I wasn't gouging them or punishing them beyond what the market itself demanded. I was simply ending their subsidized lifestyle and requiring them to pay what everyone else paid for comparable housing. If they'd been honest about their financial situation instead of using me as a scapegoat for their budget problems, this adjustment might have felt different. But honesty had never been their strength. The notice went out on a Friday afternoon. I spent the weekend imagining Marcus opening that envelope, seeing the new rental amount, realizing that his comfortable life had just become significantly more expensive. I pictured the conversations he and Keisha would have, the budgeting discussions, the recognition that they could no longer afford both their luxury cars and their below-market rent. But more than the financial impact, I imagined the moment when Marcus would understand that his mother, the woman he'd called an extra mouth to feed, now controlled something he needed. The power dynamic that had allowed him to ship me off to a studio apartment had shifted completely, and he was only beginning to comprehend the implications. For the first time since Jerome's death, I felt like I was playing chess instead of checkers, thinking several moves ahead instead of simply reacting to other people's decisions about my life. Marcus showed up at my studio apartment unannounced on a Sunday evening, his face flushed with anger, and something that looked disturbingly like panic. I could see him through the peephole, pacing back and forth in the hallway like a caged animal, his usually perfect appearance disheveled in ways that suggested he'd been running his hands through his hair and loosening his tie throughout a day of mounting stress. When I opened the door, he pushed past me without invitation, waving the rent increase notice like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite articulate. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His cologne couldn't mask the scent of nervous sweat, and his eyes had the wild look of someone whose comfortable world had just tilted off its axis. "You can't do this," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled fury I remembered from his teenage years when he didn't get his way. "This is vindictive. This is punishment." I closed the door calmly and moved to the kitchenette, putting physical distance between us while I processed his unexpected visit. My small apartment suddenly felt even smaller with his anger filling the space, but I refused to be intimidated in my own home. Not again, not by anyone. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite my racing heartbeat. "Don't give me that polite nonsense," he snapped. "We need to talk about this rent situation. $600 more per month? That's ridiculous. That's revenge." I busied myself with the coffee maker, needing the familiar ritual to steady my hands and organize my thoughts. "Son, this is business. I'm bringing all units up to market rate. Would you prefer I make exceptions based on personal relationships? That doesn't seem professional. Don't give me that corporate nonsense." His voice cracked with desperation. "You're doing this because you're angry about." "About what?" I turned to face him, coffee forgotten. "About being made to feel like a burden in my own son's house? About packing my life into boxes twice in 1 year? Because the people I raised decided I was too expensive to love? About being called an extra mouth to feed by the child I worked 3 jobs to put through college?" Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him, color draining from his face. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort from fears he couldn't name. But that vulnerable moment passed quickly, replaced by the defensive anger of a man who knew he was wrong but wasn't ready to admit it. "This isn't about that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then what is it about, Marcus? Help me understand how you can afford luxury cars and private school tuition, but couldn't afford to let your grieving mother stay in your guest room for more than 4 months. He began pacing again, his movements jerky and agitated. It wasn't about money. It was about space, about privacy, about your wife's comfort being more important than your mother's dignity. That stopped him cold. He turned to face me, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. The silence stretched between us, heavy with truths neither of us had spoken aloud until now. "You left," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You packed your bags and you left." "No, Marcus. I was told to leave. There's a difference, and deep down you know it. The new rent was due in 30 days, and I didn't hear directly from Marcus during that time, but I watched Unit 18B carefully through the building's security system and reports from my property management company. The changes were subtle but telling. Lights stayed on later into the evening, suggesting lengthy discussions about budgets and priorities. Voices carried through the thin walls. Heated conversations that my property manager discreetly reported as domestic disagreements about financial matters. Keisha's luxury SUV, a white Lexus with monthly payments that probably matched their old rent, disappeared from the parking lot during the second week. In its place appeared a used Honda sedan, reliable but humble, the kind of practical choice that people make when their comfortable lives suddenly require uncomfortable adjustments. I felt a flicker of something watching that substitution. Not quite satisfaction, not quite guilt, but something that might have been recognition of consequences finally catching up to choices. The private school that Zoe attended, Westside Academy, with its $15,000 annual tuition and waiting list of ambitious parents, required a mid-semester payment that coincided almost exactly with their first rent increase. I knew about this timing not through any deliberate surveillance, but through the innocent chatter of other tenants who mentioned seeing moving trucks at various units. Young families navigating the constant juggling act between what they wanted for their children and what they could realistically afford. My property manager called me during the third week with an update that didn't surprise me, but still made my stomach clench with complicated emotions. Mrs. Washington, we have a situation with Unit 18B. The tenants are requesting a payment plan for their rent. They've submitted documentation showing, well, they're experiencing some financial adjustments. Financial adjustments. Such a polite way to describe the moment when artificial subsidies end and reality reasserts itself. I considered this information carefully, weighing the business decision against the personal history that had brought us to this point. What's the company's standard policy on payment plans? I asked. We can work with tenants facing temporary hardship, but we need documentation of the circumstances and a realistic timeline for bringing the account current. Most property owners prefer to avoid eviction costs if tenants are making good faith efforts. Follow standard procedure, I said after a long pause. No special treatment, but no arbitrary harshness either. Treat them exactly like any other tenant in similar circumstances. That evening, I received a call that made my chest tight with guilt and longing. Zoe's voice, small and confused, came through my phone like a ghost from the life I'd been forced to leave behind. Grandma Dorothy? Mama and Daddy are fighting again. Mama's been crying and Daddy keeps saying bad words about money and about you. My granddaughter's words hit me like physical blows. Whatever was happening between Marcus and me, Zoe didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of adult pride and wounded feelings. She was an innocent casualty in a war she didn't understand, suffering because the adults in her life couldn't figure out how to love each other without conditions. Are you okay, baby girl? I asked, my voice gentle despite the storm of emotions her call had triggered. I miss you, she whispered. Can I come visit you? Please. I closed my eyes, thinking about the child I'd helped raise, the granddaughter who'd been the bright spot in my son's house during those 4 difficult months. You'll have to ask your parents, sweetheart. I did. They said no. Her voice carried a defeat that no 10-year-old should ever have to experience. They said it's complicated and I wouldn't understand. After she hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and wondered if I was becoming the very thing I'd never wanted to be. Someone who used power to hurt instead of heal, someone who let wounded pride override the love that should have guided every decision involving family. The eviction notice was standard procedure after 60 days of partial payments, but it felt like something far more significant than a business transaction. Marcus and Keisha had been paying only their old rent amount, $1,200 instead of the required $1,800, treating the increase like a suggestion rather than a contractual obligation. By legal standards, they were in default of their lease, subject to the same remedies available to any landlord dealing with non-compliant tenants. My property management company called to confirm I wanted to proceed with formal eviction proceedings, their tone carefully neutral, but tinged with the awkwardness that comes from managing a situation where business and family intersect in uncomfortable ways. Mrs. Washington, we've prepared the necessary documentation, but given that this is, well, it's a family matter, the manager said carefully. Are you sure you want to proceed with legal action? Evictions can be costly and time-consuming, and they create permanent records that affect future housing opportunities. I understood what she was really asking. Was I prepared to make my son and granddaughter homeless over $600 a month? Was my wounded pride worth destroying their housing security and potentially damaging their financial future? Was I willing to be the kind of person who chose revenge over reconciliation? But her question missed the deeper truth of the situation. This wasn't about $600 or even about revenge. This was about the lesson that actions have consequences, that treating family members as disposable comes with costs that extend far beyond the initial decision. Marcus and Keisha had made me homeless with 2 weeks' notice, forcing me to rebuild my life at 72 because my presence in their comfortable world had become inconvenient. Now they were experiencing their own version of housing insecurity, their own confrontation with the reality that stable shelter isn't guaranteed just because you believe you deserve it. The difference was that I was offering them legal due process, time to make arrangements, and the opportunity to negotiate, courtesies they hadn't extended to me when they decided I was an extra mouth to feed. Proceed with standard protocol, I told the property manager, my voice steadier than I felt. But ensure they understand all their options for resolving the situation. I'm not interested in being punitive beyond what the situation requires. The eviction notice was served on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a sheriff's deputy in accordance with Georgia law. I wasn't there to see Marcus receive it, but I could imagine his face as he realized that his mother, the woman he'd discarded like unwanted furniture, now held the power to make him and his family homeless. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment staring at the legal documents that gave me the authority to remove my own son from his home. The papers felt heavy in my hands, weighted with more than just legal significance. They represented a choice about what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of justice I believed in, and how far I was willing to go to make my point about dignity and respect. Jerome's voice echoed in my memory, gentle but clear. Dorothy, being right isn't the same as being righteous. Sometimes the biggest victory is knowing when to stop fighting. But Jerome wasn't here to see his son abandon his mother. Jerome hadn't been forced to pack his life into boxes twice in 1 year, hadn't been made to feel like a burden by the very people he'd sacrificed everything to love and support. The next morning, I woke to pounding on my door that sounded like desperation made audible. Marcus appeared at my door at 6 a.m., still in his pajamas, his hair disheveled and his eyes wild with the kind of panic that comes from realizing you've underestimated someone's capacity for consequences. He looked like he hadn't slept, his face gaunt and his hands shaking as he gripped the eviction notice like evidence of a crime he couldn't believe had been committed against him. "Please," he said before I could even invite him in, his voice breaking on that single word. "Please don't do this. We'll figure out the money. I'll get a second job. Keisha will go back to work. Just don't throw us out." The man standing in my doorway bore little resemblance to the confident executive who'd delivered my eviction notice just a few months earlier. This was someone who'd been stripped of his certainty, who'd discovered that the power he'd wielded so casually could be wielded against him with equal effectiveness. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son was now begging for the same consideration he'd denied me when I was vulnerable and grieving. I stepped aside to let him in, noting how he perched on the edge of my small couch, like he might need to run at any moment. His expensive pajamas looked absurd in my modest apartment, a reminder of the lifestyle he'd been protecting when he decided I was too expensive to accommodate. "Sit down," I said, my voice gentler than I felt. "Would you like some coffee?" He shook his head, too agitated for social niceties. "Mama, I know you're angry with me. I know I hurt you. But please don't take it out on Zoe. She doesn't deserve this." The mention of my granddaughter hit me like a physical blow. In my focus on teaching Marcus about consequences, I'd forgotten about the most innocent victim in this situation. Zoe, who'd done nothing wrong except be born to parents who'd made terrible decisions about family loyalty. Zoe, who'd already lost her grandmother's daily presence, and was now facing the possibility of losing her home as well. "Do you remember?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. What you said when you asked me to leave your house? He stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. You said it was what was best for everyone. That I needed to make other arrangements because my presence was disrupting your comfortable life. I kept my voice steady, factual rather than emotional. Now you're in a position to make other arrangements. There are apartments you can afford, neighborhoods where your family can be together, schools where Zoe can get an excellent education. But her friends, her school, the life we've built here, will adapt. Children are resilient when their parents make sacrifices for the family instead of sacrificing family for their own comfort. Marcus looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen since he was a child. Genuine remorse mixed with dawning understanding. You're teaching me a lesson. I'm teaching you what it feels like to be disposable, to have your security depend on someone else's goodwill, to discover that the people you trusted most are capable of devastating betrayal. But Zoe will learn that actions have consequences, that treating people badly doesn't happen in a vacuum, that family loyalty is something you practice, not something you assume. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. She'll also learn that her grandmother is not someone to underestimate. The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had since Jerome's funeral. Marcus talked about his fear of responsibility, his anxiety about taking care of an aging parent, his wife's resentment about sharing their space. I talked about loneliness, about feeling discarded, about the specific cruelty of being rejected by the child you'd sacrificed everything to raise. By the time he left 2 hours later, we'd reached an understanding that felt less like reconciliation and more like a ceasefire. Fragile, conditional, but real. The eviction didn't happen, but not because I'd had a change of heart about consequences, or because Marcus's desperation had softened my resolve. Instead, I made him an offer that would teach the lesson I wanted him to learn while keeping my granddaughter's life stable. He could stay at the current market rent if he agreed to work as the building's maintenance coordinator. You want me to be your employee? He asked when I presented the proposal during our second difficult conversation, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and wounded pride. I want you to understand what it means to earn your place instead of expecting it to be given to you. I replied. 20 hours a week, handling minor repairs, coordinating with contractors, maintaining common areas. The work is honest, necessary, and it comes with the benefit of keeping your housing costs manageable. The job wasn't charity disguised as employment. Magnolia Court genuinely needed on-site maintenance coordination, and Marcus had skills that translated well to property management, organizational abilities, communication skills, and the kind of problem-solving experience that came from years in corporate environments. The previous owner had contracted out all maintenance work, but having someone available for immediate responses to tenant needs would improve both service quality and cost efficiency. Marcus struggled with the offer for 3 days, his pride warring with his practical needs. I could imagine the conversations he and Keisha were having, the calculations about mortgage payments and car loans and Zoe's education costs. The mathematics of their comfortable life required either accepting my terms or making dramatic lifestyle changes that would affect every aspect of their family's future. He took the job on a Thursday morning, showing up at my apartment with a toolbox he'd borrowed from a neighbor, and a humility I hadn't seen since his childhood. I'll need to learn some things, he admitted, standing in my doorway in work clothes instead of his usual business attire. I'm not exactly handy. Skills can be learned, I told him. Character is harder to develop, but you're getting practice. Keisha went back to work part-time at a marketing firm downtown, swallowing her pride and accepting a position that paid half what she'd made before Zoe was born. They moved Zoe from Westside Academy to the local public school, which turned out to have an excellent arts program that sparked interests her expensive private education had never encouraged. Watching Marcus clean gutters and fix leaky faucets gave me no joy, but it gave me something more valuable: perspective on the man I'd raised and the lessons he still needed to learn. He was discovering what I'd always known: that dignity comes from contribution, not consumption. That real security is built through work and responsibility rather than assumptions about what you deserve. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was real. Within 2 months, Marcus had developed a competence and confidence in his maintenance role that surprised both of us. He learned to diagnose HVAC problems, coordinate with contractors, and handle tenant requests with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to corporate projects. More importantly, he began to understand the daily realities of providing homes for people. The responsibility that came with being someone others depended on for their basic shelter and comfort. The other tenants responded well to having on-site maintenance support. Instead of waiting days for repairs, they could knock on Marcus's door and get immediate attention for urgent issues. The building operated more smoothly, maintenance costs decreased due to prompt attention to small problems before they became expensive repairs, and tenant satisfaction improved measurably. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The entitled executive who'd treated his mother like a burden was being replaced by someone who understood the dignity of essential work, the satisfaction of solving problems for people who trusted him with their homes. He still struggled with his pride. I could see it in his face when he had to snake a drain or replace broken tiles. But he was learning that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of. Keisha's return to the workforce had its own ripple effects. The marketing firm where she worked part-time valued her experience and offered flexible scheduling that allowed her to maintain family responsibilities while contributing to their financial stability. She seemed happier than she'd been in years, more engaged with her own life beyond the role of corporate wife and privileged mother. Zoe's transition to public school turned out to be the most positive change of all. Clayton Elementary had a diverse student body, excellent teachers, and an arts program that recognized her talent for painting and music. She made friends from different backgrounds, learned Spanish from native speakers, and discovered that educational excellence didn't require expensive tuition. It required engaged teachers and curious students. One Saturday afternoon, I found Marcus replacing weather stripping around the building's entrance doors, his hands steady and competent with tools he was still learning to use. He looked up when he saw me approaching, and for the first time in months, his smile was genuine rather than strained. "The heating bills should be lower this winter," he said, gesturing to the improved seals. Mrs. Patterson in 12A mentioned her apartment was drafty, so I checked all the common area doors. Found gaps in half of them. I nodded approvingly. "That's good work. Preventive maintenance saves money and keeps tenants comfortable." "I never realized how much goes into maintaining a building like this," he admitted, wiping his hands on a work rag. "How much responsibility comes with providing homes for people." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging the lesson I'd been trying to teach him about the weight of taking care of others, about the complexity of decisions that affect people's basic security and comfort. We stood together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching residents come and go from their homes, people whose daily lives were improved by his attention to details most would never notice. "Mama," he said finally, his voice quiet but clear, "I owe you an apology that's about 3 months overdue." The apology came not as a grand gesture or emotional breakdown, but as a simple acknowledgement delivered while we stood in the building lobby on a crisp October afternoon. Marcus had been working for 2 months as the maintenance coordinator, and the changes in him were visible in ways both subtle and profound. His hands were calloused now, his posture less rigid, his interactions with tenants characterized by genuine helpfulness rather than corporate politeness. "I owe you more than an apology," he continued, setting down his toolbox and meeting my eyes directly for the first time since this whole situation began. "I owe you respect. I owe you gratitude. I owe you the truth about why I really asked you to leave." I waited, giving him space to find the words he'd been avoiding for months. "After Dad died, I was terrified," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Not just sad or grieving, terrified. Because I realized that taking care of you was going to become my responsibility, and I didn't think I was strong enough to do it right. Dad made it look so easy, the way he loved you, the way he supported the family. But I felt like I'd inherited obligations I didn't know how to meet." His honesty surprised me with its completeness. I'd expected defensive justifications or attempts to shift blame to Keisha, but this was raw acknowledgement of his own fears and failures. "So instead of talking to you about my concerns, instead of asking for help figuring out how to be the son you needed, I took the easy way out. I convinced myself that shipping you off to your own place was what was best for everyone, when really it was just what was easiest for me." A tenant passed through the lobby, nodding politely to both of us. Mrs. Chun from apartment 8B had been having trouble with her garbage disposal, and Marcus had spent an hour the previous day teaching her how to reset it herself. These small interactions had become part of his daily routine, moments when he practiced being useful rather than simply successful. I was ashamed, he continued once we were alone again. Ashamed that I wasn't the man Dad was. Ashamed that I was scared of responsibility instead of embracing it. Ashamed that I let Keisha's comfort matter more than your dignity. So I pushed you away instead of stepping up. The weight of his words settled between us like dust after a demolition. The debris of old assumptions and failed expectations that needed to be cleared away before anything new could be built. And now? I asked. Now I understand what you were trying to teach me. That being strong doesn't mean avoiding hard situations. It means facing them with grace and wisdom. That taking care of family isn't a burden, it's a privilege. That when you love someone, you make room in your life for them, even when it's inconvenient. Marcus picked up his toolbox again, but made no move to leave. I know you bought this building because the opportunity presented itself, but I also know you could have chosen differently about how to handle finding us here. You could have thrown us out immediately, could have made our lives miserable just because you had the power to do it. Instead, you gave me a chance to learn what I should have known all along. The afternoon sun slanted through the lobby windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor that Marcus had mopped that morning as part of his building maintenance routine. For months, I'd been waiting for this moment, for him to understand not just what he'd done wrong, but why it mattered and how it had affected more than just my living situation. What I did to you was unforgivable, he said quietly. But if you're willing, I'd like to spend whatever time I have left proving that I learned something from it. I looked at my son, still my baby boy despite everything, despite the pain and the lessons and the hard-won understanding that had brought us to this moment. He'd grown into something better than he'd been, not through my lectures or anger, but through the daily practice of taking responsibility for other people's welfare. Apology accepted, I said simply. Now let's go see about Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen faucet. She called this morning about water pressure problems. As we walked toward the elevator together, Marcus carrying his tools and me carrying the master keys, I realized that this was what reconciliation looked like. Not dramatic forgiveness scenes or tearful reunions, but the quiet decision to work together toward something better than what had been broken. The first real sign that our family was healing came 3 weeks later, when Keisha appeared at my apartment door on a Saturday afternoon carrying a plate of homemade cookies, and wearing an expression that mixed determination with nervousness. She'd lost weight since their financial adjustments began, but she looked healthier somehow, more engaged with her own life, less focused on maintaining appearances that had always seemed to exhaust her. Mrs. Washington, she began, then stopped and corrected herself. Dorothy, I was hoping we could talk. I invited her in, noting how she looked around my small studio apartment with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than the barely concealed horror I'd expected. She sat carefully on my small couch, the plate of cookies balanced on her knees like an offering or perhaps a peace treaty. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble, her voice steadier than her hands. And more than that, I owe you the truth about why I wanted you to leave. I settled into my chair across from her, prepared for justifications or excuses, but hoping for something more honest. I was jealous, she said, the words seeming to surprise her as much as they surprised me. Jealous of how much Zoe loved you, jealous of how Marcus lit up when he talked about his childhood, jealous of the way you could make a house feel like home just by being in it. I'd been trying for 15 years to create the kind of family warmth that seemed to come naturally to you, and having you there made me feel like I was failing. Her honesty was unexpected and more painful than any excuse would have been. I could see the effort it took for her to admit these things, to acknowledge feelings that probably seemed petty even to her. When Zoe said your mac and cheese was better than mine, it wasn't really about the food, she continued. It was about everything I thought I was supposed to be as a wife and mother. All the ways I felt like I was falling short of some standard I couldn't even name. Having daily proof that someone else could do it better it was unbearable. I understood more than she probably realized. The pressure to be perfect, to meet impossible standards of domestic excellence while maintaining career success and social obligations. It was a trap that caught many women, especially those who'd grown up believing they could have everything if they just worked hard enough. I convinced Marcus that you were disrupting our routine, but really I was afraid you were showing us what our family could be if we were better people. More generous, more patient, more focused on love than on maintaining our image. She paused to wipe her eyes, and I saw the exhaustion that came from months of pretending everything was fine while her world shifted around her. These last few months have been hard, she admitted. Really hard. But they've also been clarifying. Working again, watching Marcus learn to fix things with his hands instead of just throwing money at problems. Seeing Zoe thrive in an environment where she's valued for who she is rather than what her parents can afford. It's made me realize how much energy I was spending on things that didn't actually matter. I offered her tissues and poured 2 cups of tea, giving her time to compose herself, and me time to process her unexpected vulnerability. The truth is, she said, accepting the tea gratefully, I've been happier these last 2 months than I was during the 2 years before you moved in with us. Not because our life is easier, it's definitely not, but because it's more real. More honest about what we can actually afford and who we actually are underneath all the stuff we thought defined us. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, 2 women who'd been adversaries learning to see each other as fellow human beings navigating the same complex challenges of family, identity, and purpose. I don't expect forgiveness, Keisha said finally. What I did was cruel and selfish. But I wanted you to know that I see that now, and I'm trying to be better than I was. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd married my son 15 years earlier. Stripped of her defensive armor and expensive accessories, she was just a woman trying to figure out how to build a life worth living, how to be worthy of the people who loved her. We're all trying to be better than we were, I told her. That's what family is supposed to help each other do. But the real transformation began in the small moments, the daily interactions that nobody else witnessed. I started watching Marcus through the building's security cameras, not to spy, but to witness something I'd never seen before. My son learning what it meant to be useful instead of just successful. The cameras captured him at 6 a.m., methodically checking each floor for maintenance issues before other tenants woke up. They showed him spending an extra hour with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow in 12A, not just fixing her leaky faucet, but making sure she knew how to shut off the water if it happened again. One morning, I watched him help college students in 14C move a heavy couch up 2 flights of stairs, refusing their offer of beer money because neighbors help neighbors. The entitled executive who'd treated his mother like a burden was being replaced by someone who understood that real strength comes from serving others, not from being served. The other tenants began leaving him thank you notes. Handwritten cards slipped under his door expressing gratitude for prompt repairs, for quiet problem solving, for being someone they could count on. He kept these notes in a shoebox by his front door. And I knew because Zoe mentioned it during one of our secret phone calls. Daddy has a box of letters from people in the building. She told me during a whispered conversation when her parents were arguing about car payments. He reads them when he's sad. Mama says he's becoming a different person. The changes in their family were visible even from my distance. Keisha's Lexus had been replaced by a reliable Honda, but she seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down by the pressure of maintaining appearances. She'd started working part-time at a marketing firm, and the engagement in her voice when she talked about her projects suggested she was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of professional motherhood. But it was Marcus who fascinated me most. The man who'd once commanded corporate conference rooms was learning to command respect through competence and reliability. He was discovering what I'd always known. That being needed for your skills and character felt infinitely better than being tolerated for your paycheck. One evening, I accidentally encountered him in the building lobby as he finished his maintenance rounds. His work clothes were dirty, his hands were stained with paint, and he looked exhausted. But when Mrs. Rodriguez from 6B stopped to thank him for fixing her kitchen sink, his face lit up with the kind of satisfaction I hadn't seen since he'd graduated from college. "Your mother raised you right," Mrs. Rodriguez told him, patting his arm with genuine affection. "It's rare to find young people who understand service these days." After she left, Marcus turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She doesn't know who you are," he said quietly. No, I agreed. But she knows who you're becoming. We stood together in the lobby, two people connected by blood and separated by months of hurt, watching the comfortable evening routine of residents returning to homes that Marcus now helped maintain. I'm learning things I should have known years ago, he said finally. About work, about responsibility, about what it means to take care of people instead of just providing for them. Better late than never, I replied and meant it. The conversation was brief, but it marked the beginning of something neither of us was ready to name yet. The possibility that broken things could be repaired, that relationships could be rebuilt on stronger foundations, that family could mean something deeper than shared DNA and holiday obligations. Marcus was becoming the man I'd always hoped he could be. It had just taken losing everything he thought he wanted to discover what he actually needed. A year later, Marcus knocked on my door with a different expression than I'd seen from him in decades. Humble but not broken, tired but not defeated, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that comes from earning respect rather than demanding it. He'd requested this meeting through the property management company, following proper protocols even though he was my son, understanding finally that some conversations require formal frameworks to be productive. Mama, he said when I opened the door, I need to tell you something important. I invited him in, noting how comfortable he'd become in my small space. The studio apartment that had once felt like exile now felt like home. A place where I could welcome family without feeling like I was imposing on their generosity or disrupting their carefully constructed lives. I've been thinking about something you said last year, about how being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone, he began, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot during our monthly conversations, about knowing when to ask for help and when to offer it. Over the past months, our relationship had slowly shifted from landlord-tenant to something more complex and honest. We talked regularly about building maintenance issues, but also about Zoe's progress in school, about Keisha's career development, about the small daily victories and challenges that make up family life. The conversations were easier now, less loaded with unresolved hurt, and more focused on moving forward together. I want to ask you something, Marcus continued. But I need you to know it's a real question, not an obligation disguised as an invitation. I waited, curious about what had prompted this formal approach to a conversation that could have happened casually. Keisha and I have been talking about buying a house, he said. Something smaller than what we had before, but with enough space for family. We've learned to live within our means, and we want Zoe to grow up understanding the difference between what you need and what you want. The house they'd found was a modest 3-bedroom in a good school district, with a mortgage payment they could handle comfortably on their combined incomes. It had a small yard where Zoe could play, a kitchen large enough for family meals, and most importantly to me, a mother-in-law suite that could provide independence within the context of family. We'd like you to consider living with us again, Marcus said carefully. Not as a guest this time, but as family, as someone who belongs there and whose presence makes the house a better home for everyone. The invitation was everything the first one hadn't been. Specific about expectations, honest about motivations, clear about the permanent rather than temporary nature of the arrangement. They'd learned to budget for 3 adults rather than treating my presence as an unexpected expense. They'd thought through privacy needs, household responsibilities, and the practical details that make multi-generational living successful rather than stressful. I know we hurt you, he continued. I know trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. But if you're willing to consider it, we'd like the chance to prove that we've learned how to be the family you deserved all along. I looked at my son. This man who'd grown from the entitled executive who'd shipped me off to a studio apartment into someone who understood that family was built through daily acts of consideration and respect. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been real and thorough. What does Keisha think about this? I asked. It was her idea, he said, smiling slightly. She said she'd spent 15 years trying to compete with the memory of the family warmth you represented, when she could have been learning from it instead. She wants Zoe to grow up with her grandmother's influence, wants to build the kind of home where multiple generations support each other instead of just tolerating each other. The offer was tempting in ways that had nothing to do with practical considerations, and everything to do with the deep human need to belong somewhere. To be valued not just for what you provide but for who you are. But I'd spent the last year learning to be independent, discovering strengths I hadn't known I possessed, building a life that was entirely my own choice rather than anyone else's accommodation. I need to think about it, I told him honestly. This apartment has become home in ways I didn't expect. The building, the tenants, the life I've created here. It's mine in ways nothing has been since your father died. Marcus nodded, understanding more than he would have a year earlier. Take all the time you need. The invitation is permanent, whenever you're ready for it, if you're ever ready for it. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that you were right about everything. About family, about responsibility, about the kind of man I needed to become. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself. 6 months later, I stood in the driveway of Marcus and Keisha's new house, a charming 2-story colonial with a front porch and mature oak trees, watching movers carry my belongings into what would be my new home. But this time, the boxes contained not just the remnants of a life being downsized, but the accumulated treasures of someone who'd learned to build homes wherever she landed. The mother-in-law suite was perfect. A bedroom, sitting area, kitchenette, and private bathroom that gave me independence while keeping me connected to family life. Large windows looked out onto the backyard where Zoe had already started a vegetable garden with seeds I'd saved from my herb gardening experiments at Magnolia Court. I'd sold the apartment building to a young couple who reminded me of myself and Jerome at that age, full of dreams and determination, committed to providing quality housing while building their own financial security. The sale had been profitable, but more than that, it had been purposeful. I was passing on not just a property but a philosophy about using resources to create opportunities rather than just accumulate wealth. Grandma Dorothy, Zoe called from the garden, her hands dirty with soil and her face bright with excitement. Come see how big the tomato plants are getting. At 11, she'd grown into someone I barely recognized from the child who'd been caught between adult conflicts a year earlier. Public school had broadened her world. Marcus's new priorities had given her a father who was present rather than just successful. And Keisha's return to work had provided a model of women who contributed to their families in multiple ways. "They're beautiful, baby girl," I said, kneeling beside her to examine the healthy green plants. "Your grandfather would have been so proud of this garden." "I wish I could have met him," she said, a sentiment she'd expressed often since we'd started sharing more stories about Jerome, and the life he'd built with quiet determination and endless love for his family. "You did meet him," I told her, brushing soil from her cheek. "Every time your father fixes something instead of throwing it away, every time your mother chooses family time over social obligations, every time you show kindness to someone who needs it, you're meeting the best parts of your grandfather." That evening, our first dinner in the new house was everything I'd dreamed family meals could be. Keisha had prepared roast chicken with vegetables from our garden. Marcus had fixed the wobbly dining room table himself instead of buying a new one. And Zoe had set the table with care and pride. We said grace together, thanking not just for the food but for second chances and the wisdom that comes from surviving difficult lessons. "I have an announcement," Keisha said as we finished dessert. "I've been offered a full-time position at the marketing firm, with benefits and the possibility of working from home 2 days a week." The news was celebrated with genuine enthusiasm rather than the competitive edge that had once characterized every family success. Marcus's pride in his wife's accomplishments was untainted by concerns about status or appearances. This was a family that had learned to measure success by stability and contentment rather than accumulation and recognition. "And I have news too," Marcus added. "The property management company has offered me a position managing their entire maintenance division. It would mean leaving the building maintenance work, but it would use everything I've learned this year, while providing better long-term opportunities." As we cleared the table together, all 4 of us working as a team rather than designated roles based on gender or age, I reflected on how completely our family dynamic had changed. The house that had once felt like a performance space for successful living had been replaced by a home where people were valued for their contributions rather than their images. Before bed, I sat on my new front porch, rocking in the chair Marcus had bought as a housewarming gift. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with families like ours who'd chosen substance over style, community over competition. For the first time since Jerome's death, I felt genuinely at peace with both my past and my future. Today, I'm 75 years old, and I finally understand what Jerome meant when he said I had healing hands. It wasn't about medical training or maternal instinct. It was about the willingness to do whatever was necessary to help the people I loved become their best selves, even when that meant making difficult choices that temporarily increased everyone's pain. We have Sunday dinners now, all of us around one table that Marcus built himself using skills he learned during his year as a maintenance coordinator. Sometimes Keisha makes the mac and cheese, sometimes I do, and sometimes we cook together, sharing techniques and stories while Zoe sets the table and tells us about school, friends, and the books she's reading. Zoe declares each version the best ever. And we all laugh because we know that love is the secret ingredient that makes everything taste like home. The property management position has been perfect for Marcus. He oversees maintenance for 12 apartment buildings throughout Atlanta, combining his corporate organizational skills with the hands-on knowledge he gained from our year of hard lessons. His teams respect him because he understands their work from experience, not just theory. Tenants trust him because he's learned that providing homes for people is both a business responsibility and a moral obligation. Keisha's marketing career has flourished in ways that surprise all of us. Her clients appreciate her authenticity, her ability to understand what families actually need rather than what advertising tells them they should want. She's built a reputation for campaigns that speak to real people facing real challenges, and her income now exceeds what Marcus earns. A reversal of traditional roles that they've embraced with humor and mutual support. But it's Zoe who represents the real victory in our family's transformation. At 13, she's confident without being entitled, ambitious without being ruthless, kind without being naive. She volunteers at the community garden we started in our neighborhood, helps elderly neighbors with technology problems, and talks about college majors that would let her help people build better lives. Language that echoes the values we've finally learned to practice rather than just preach. Last month, she asked me about the year when everything changed in our family. "Grandma, why did you buy Daddy's building? Were you trying to get revenge?" I considered her question carefully, wanting to give her an answer that honored both the complexity of adult relationships and her right to understand her family's history. I bought the building because I needed to take control of my own life after feeling powerless for too long. What happened after that wasn't revenge, it was consequences. Your parents had to learn that treating people badly doesn't happen in a vacuum. That family loyalty is something you practice every day, not something you assume will always be there. "But you forgave them," she said. "Even after they hurt you. Forgiveness isn't about pretending bad things didn't happen," I told her. "It's about deciding that people can grow beyond their worst moments if they're willing to do the work. Your parents did the work. They learned to be better than they were." The conversations I have with Zoe now are the ones I wish I'd been able to have with Marcus when he was her age. Honest discussions about character, responsibility, and the daily choices that determine what kind of person you become. She's learning these lessons in the context of a family that practices them rather than just talks about them. Sometimes I think about the studio apartment at Sunset Manor, the months when I felt discarded and forgotten. Those were dark times, but they were also necessary, not as punishment, but as the foundation for everything that came after. I had to learn who I was when stripped of my traditional roles as wife and mother before I could reclaim those identities on terms that honored my own worth. I didn't buy that building for revenge, though I won't pretend the irony wasn't satisfying. I bought it because I needed to prove to myself that I was more than the sum of other people's needs and expectations. The woman who'd spent decades taking care of everyone else had to learn to take care of herself first, to build a life that was chosen rather than assigned. The foundation is solid now. We built it ourselves, one honest conversation and one act of genuine service at a time. Marcus learned that being a man means showing up reliably for the people who count on you. Keisha learned that being a woman means contributing your talents to your family's welfare rather than competing with other women for domestic perfection. Zoe is learning that being part of a family means supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning ship when things get complicated. And I learned that being 72 doesn't mean accepting whatever scraps of consideration other people choose to offer. It means using the wisdom earned through decades of experience to build the life you actually want, surrounded by people who value you for who you are rather than what you provide. The house we share now feels different from any place I've ever lived. It's not Jerome's house or Marcus's house or even our house in any possessive sense. It's home. The kind of place where people grow into their best selves because they're supported by others who are doing the same difficult, necessary work. On quiet evenings, when Zoe is doing homework at the kitchen table and Marcus is reading in his chair, and Keisha is planning marketing campaigns on her laptop, I sometimes catch Jerome's scent in the air, or hear his laughter in the comfortable sounds of family life. He's not gone, not really. He's present in every moment when we choose love over convenience, service over status, truth over comfort. This is what it looks like to build something that lasts. Not perfect people making perfect choices, but imperfect people committed to becoming better than they were yesterday. The foundation is strong because it's built on honesty rather than appearances, on daily acts of consideration rather than grand gestures of affection. And that's a story worth telling, a legacy worth leaving, a home worth building. One conversation, one choice, one day at a time.